At precisely 7:42 in the morning, on the 17th day of August, in the year 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna was positioned beneath the left wing of a P-38 Lightning aircraft. This took place at the Dobodura Airfield in New Guinea. He observed his pilot preparing for an undertaking that held a strong probability of not being survived. The pilot in question was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, aged 23. He had completed 6 combat sorties, achieving 0 aerial victories. The Japanese military had dispatched 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters with the intent of intercepting the morning patrol. Lieutenant Hayes was slated to fly directly into their path. Sergeant McKenna had been dedicated to the maintenance of P-38 aircraft for a period of 8 months. He possessed an intimate understanding of the aircraft, knowing its every detail. It was a twin-engine fighter, characterized by its distinctive twin boom configuration. While exceptionally swift in a straight trajectory, it excelled at high altitudes, proving to be an absolute powerhouse. However, the P-38 harbored a single, potentially fatal flaw that was contributing to the daily demise of American aviators. This vulnerability lay in its inability to execute a tight turn in opposition to a Zero fighter. The Zero was a lighter and far more nimble adversary. It could complete a full horizontal turn in half the time that a P-38 required, a critical disadvantage in aerial combat. This temporal difference translated directly into a matter of life and death. American military doctrine dictated that P-38 pilots should strictly avoid engaging in turning battles with Zeros. The directive was explicit: never attempt to outmaneuver them. Instead, the strategy was to leverage speed and altitude, execute a swift dive, deliver fire, and then rapidly ascend, performing a hit-and-run tactic. The objective was to avoid being ensnared in a protracted turning engagement. Lieutenant Hayes had adhered to this doctrine on 5 separate occasions, yet it had proven ineffective. The Zero pilots were demonstrably adept at their tactics. They would skillfully lure American pilots into turns, then cut inside their turning radius, securing a position on their tails and subsequently shooting them down. The 5th Air Force had sustained the loss of 37 P-38 aircraft within the preceding 6 weeks alone. The majority of these losses were attributed to pilots being caught in inescapable turning engagements. Sergeant McKenna had borne witness to the deaths of an excessive number of pilots, all of whom were young men, veritable youths. They had entered their P-38s with unwavering confidence, only to return in coffins or not return at all. The official training manual attributed these incidents to pilot error. The instructors maintained that these pilots were failing to adhere to established doctrine. However, Sergeant McKenna held a contrary belief. He was convinced that the issue lay not with the pilots, but with the aircraft's control cables. The aileron control cables for the P-38 extended through the twin booms to the rear empennage, subsequently routing forward via a system of pulleys to the wing control surfaces. This cable system suffered from a degree of slack. Though minute, perhaps amounting to 3/8 of an inch at full deflection, this minuscule play introduced a discernible delay between the pilot's input on the control stick and the corresponding response of the ailerons. At elevated speeds, this delay was negligible. However, at lower speeds, particularly during aggressive turning maneuvers, this fractional second of latency represented the critical distinction between successfully executing a role within the turning radius of a Zero and succumbing to enemy fire. Sergeant McKenna had raised this specific concern with the engineering officer 2 months prior. The officer's response was that the cable tension was entirely within the permissible specifications. The factory tolerances inherently accounted for such slack. Any attempt to alter this would render the aircraft's warranty invalid. Furthermore, no field mechanic possessed the requisite authority to modify flight control systems. Such modifications necessitated explicit engineering approval from Lockheed, a firm situated 7,000 miles away in California. Consequently, Sergeant McKenna took a course of action that contravened every regulation within the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual. He procured a length of piano wire from a damaged aircraft, precisely cutting it to 6 inches. He then meticulously bent it into a Z-shaped configuration and installed it as a tensioning device onto Lieutenant Hayes's left aileron control cable. This modification process consumed a mere 8 minutes. It introduced an additional 0.4 pounds of tension to the cable, thereby completely eradicating the slack. This clandestine alteration went entirely unnoticed. The inspection crew that morning did not scrutinize the cable tension. Their focus was directed towards engine oil levels and ammunition loads. Sergeant McKenna remained silent about his intervention. He watched as Lieutenant Hayes taxied the aircraft to the runway, then observed its ascent into the morning sky, disappearing towards the Japanese fighter contingent. The events that transpired over the subsequent 17 minutes would fundamentally alter the operational protocols for every P-38 aircraft deployed within the Pacific Theater. The first pilot McKenna lost to a zero was Lieutenant David Chen. This occurred on the 9th day of July in the year 1943. Lieutenant Chen had been in the theater of operations for a mere 3 weeks. Sergeant McKenna had personally worked on Lieutenant Chen's aircraft each morning. They had conversed about California, Chen hailing from Sacramento and McKenna from Long Beach. Both men had prior experience working on automobiles before the war commenced. Lieutenant Chen departed at 06:15 hours for a fighter sweep overlay mission. He returned 2 hours later, bearing 3 bullet perforations in his left boom and a harrowing account of a zero that had managed to penetrate his defensive turn. Chen recounted his attempt to roll out and dive away, as prescribed by the manual. However, the aircraft exhibited a sluggish response, as if there were a discernible lag between his control inputs and the actual maneuver. The zero had nearly achieved its objective. The only factor that averted disaster was the timely intervention of Chen's wingman, who successfully shot the zero off his tail. McKenna meticulously examined the bullet holes. They were clustered tightly together, indicative of precise deflection shooting. The Zero pilot had evidently anticipated Chen's flight path with uncanny accuracy, predicting the precise location of Chen's aircraft. This level of precision should have been unattainable if Chen had executed a sharp roll and immediate dive. Unless, of course, the aircraft's response had been sufficiently delayed to allow the Zero pilot to establish the necessary lead. Lieutenant Chen did not fly again. His aircraft was returned to the depot for necessary repairs. Sergeant McKenna never saw him again. 3 weeks later, he learned that Chen had been fatally shot down while piloting a different P-38 over Rabaul. The circumstances were strikingly similar: caught in a turning engagement and unable to roll out with sufficient alacrity. The second pilot lost was Captain William Morrison. Captain Morrison was a flight leader, an experienced combat pilot with 11 confirmed kills to his credit. He possessed an extensive understanding of the P-38, including its inherent limitations. He flew with considerable intelligence. On the 3rd day of August, Captain Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at an altitude of 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison successfully downed 1 Zero on his initial pass. As he commenced a second run, 2 Zeros executed a reversal maneuver and engaged him. McKenna subsequently heard the radio transmissions detailing the encounter. Morrison attempted to roll inverted and execute a split S maneuver for evasion. He transmitted that his controls felt unresponsive, or mushy. The 2 Zeros maintained pursuit throughout the maneuver, ultimately shooting him down at an altitude of 4,000 feet. Morrison's wingman reported that it appeared Captain Morrison's aircraft was not responding with adequate speed, as if he were struggling against the controls. Captain Morrison perished in the ensuing crash. Morrison's crew chief was a colleague of McKenna's, an individual named Rodriguez from Texas. Rodriguez harbored a strong conviction that something was fundamentally amiss with Morrison's aircraft. He conducted an exhaustive inspection of the aircraft following the recovery of the wreckage. Engine settings, control surface rigging, cable tensions. Every aspect was meticulously checked and found to be within specified parameters. There was demonstrably nothing wrong with the aircraft. The official report cited pilot error. Rodriguez, however, remained unconvinced, and so too did McKenna. By the middle of August, McKenna had witnessed the deaths of 17 pilots. Some were individuals he knew well, while others he had only encountered briefly during pre-flight checks. Regardless of their familiarity, he had worked on all of their aircraft, signed off on their maintenance logs, and observed them taxiing for departure and then lifting into the sky. Some returned, while others never did. Those who did manage to return consistently relayed a similar narrative. They described the P-38 as feeling sluggish in its response during demanding maneuvers, exhibiting a subtle lag between the pilot's control inputs and the aircraft's actual reaction. Most pilots attributed this perceived sluggishness to the inherent characteristics of the aircraft itself, a heavy fighter with large control surfaces, where some degree of delay was considered normal. However, McKenna knew this was not the case. He had personally experienced that delay when working on the control cables, recognizing the subtle slack within the system. He began to pay closer attention to the auditory feedback produced by the cables during tensioning procedures. A distinct tonal quality, a low, resonant twang, would emanate when they were plucked. Loose cables produced a different sound compared to tightly tensioned ones. McKenna possessed the acuity to discern this difference. Every P-38 aircraft on the flight line exhibited cables that produced a sound indicative of slight looseness. Although still within regulatory limits, they were, in his assessment, loose. He confided this observation to Rodriguez one evening, shortly after Morrison's fatal encounter. Rodriguez inquired about potential remedial actions. McKenna responded that while no official solution existed, an unofficial remedy was feasible, albeit one that involved contravening regulations and potentially incurring court-martial proceedings for both of them. The fundamental issue was not a deficit in the pilot's knowledge of how to engage enemy aircraft. They possessed this knowledge. Every briefing emphasized it, and every training flight drilled the doctrine into them. Never engage in a turning fight with a zero. Leverage speed and altitude. Execute hit-and-run tactics. The doctrine was clear and unambiguous. The critical problem was that the realities of combat frequently deviated from established doctrine. Lieutenant Robert Hayes had been stationed in New Guinea for 2 months. He was 23 years old, a farm boy from Iowa. He had flown 6 combat missions, but had yet to achieve a single kill. This was not due to a lack of piloting skill, but rather because he diligently adhered to the established protocols. These protocols, however, consistently placed him in situations where acquiring a clear shot proved exceedingly difficult. During his 3rd mission, Hayes initiated a dive on a zero from a significant altitude, accelerating to 400 miles per hour and approaching from the sun's direction, precisely as the manual advised. He managed to bring the zero within his gun sight and began to adjust his aim for a deflection shot. The zero executed a rapid roll to the left and commenced a dive. Hayes attempted to follow suit. His P-38 rolled into the turn, but the sensation was akin to moving through thick mud. By the time his aircraft was oriented in the desired direction, the zero had already evaded. Hayes broke off his pursuit and ascended back to altitude, having not fired a single shot. His 4th mission proved even more challenging. Hayes and his wingman engaged 2 zeros at an altitude of 15,000 feet. Hayes released his first burst of fire, but missed. The zero executed a sharp right turn. Hayes rolled to pursue. His wingman issued a warning about 2 additional zeros approaching from above. Hayes attempted to roll back to a level attitude and dive away. The aircraft responded, but with noticeable slowness. This delay was precisely sufficient for one of the diving Zeros to deliver a 3-second burst of fire from its 20mm cannon shells into Hayes's right boom. While the shells did not penetrate the aircraft, they instilled such a profound sense of alarm in Hayes that he broke off the engagement and made a hasty retreat towards home, his engines trailing smoke. During his 5th mission, Hayes witnessed the tragic demise of his wingman. The wingman's name was Lieutenant Thomas Parker, a 21-year-old from Boston. They had completed their flight training together. On the 14th day of August, Parker became separated from the main formation during a dogfight over Finchhofen. 2 Zeros aggressively pursued him. Parker employed every evasive tactic at his disposal. He rolled sharply, reversed direction, and attempted scissor maneuvers. The Zeros, however, remained locked onto his tail throughout every maneuver. Hayes heard Parker's increasingly desperate calls for assistance over the radio, detecting the rising panic in his voice. He heard Parker exclaim that his aircraft was not turning with sufficient speed. Then came the sounds of gunfire, followed by Parker's scream, and then silence. Hayes did not sleep that night, nor did most of the squadron. Lieutenant Parker's bunk remained unoccupied. His personal belongings were collected and dispatched home. His P-38 was officially recorded as a combat loss. The maintenance log indicated no mechanical deficiencies. The officially declared cause was pilot error during defensive maneuvering. Sergeant McKenna had performed maintenance on Parker's aircraft on the very morning he perished. Every aspect of the aircraft had been deemed perfect. Engine timing, control surface alignment, and cable tension all within the specified tolerances. The aircraft was, by all accounts, sound. Yet, Parker was dead nonetheless, and McKenna understood the reason why. That infinitesimal delay in the aircraft's response, that minute degree of slack that the manual deemed acceptable, had claimed Parker's life, just as it had claimed the lives of Morrison, Chen, and 14 other pilots. The most pervasive and unsettling aspect was the pervasive odor. Each morning, as McKenna worked within the maintenance hangar, his senses were assailed by the mingled scents of aviation fuel, heated metal, and hydraulic fluid. It was the characteristic aroma of aircraft being prepared for combat. Some of these machines would return from their sorties, while others would not. And McKenna would invariably be present the following morning, enveloped by the same olfactory tapestry, tending to more aircraft, and observing more pilots ascend into machines that were demonstrably incapable of responding with the necessary alacrity to ensure their survival. On the evening of August the 16th, Lieutenant Hayes approached the maintenance area and located Sergeant McKenna diligently working on his assigned P-38. Lieutenant Hayes inquired whether there was anything McKenna could do to enhance the aircraft's rolling speed, emphasizing anything at all. Hayes conveyed that he was unconcerned with regulatory compliance. His sole desire was for a fighting chance. McKenna regarded Lieutenant Hayes, perceiving the palpable fear and desperation etched on his face. He saw a young man who was acutely aware that his life hung precariously in the balance unless a significant change occurred. Sergeant McKenna instructed Lieutenant Hayes to return the following morning, stating he would investigate what modifications were feasible. McKenna labored alone throughout the night. The maintenance hangar had fallen into a profound quietude after 23 hours. The majority of the maintenance crew had retired for the night. The only audible sounds were the distant, intermittent hum of generators and the incessant buzzing of insects against the overhead illumination fixtures. The air was thick with the scent of engine oil and the pervasive tropical humidity. He carefully removed the inspection panel from the left boom of Lieutenant Hayes's P-38. The metal still retained warmth from the day's sun. Within the compartment, the aileron control cable traversed a series of pulleys, directing its path towards the tail section. Sergeant McKenna grasped the cable firmly with both hands and exerted a pulling force. He could distinctly feel the slack, an estimated 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension engaged. His hands, thoroughly coated in grease, and his fingers ached from a full day of demanding maintenance work. Despite this discomfort, he could clearly discern the slack. It was incorrect. He was certain of it. The piano wire originated from a P-38 aircraft that had experienced a ground loop 2 weeks prior and was subsequently deemed a total loss. Although the aircraft was essentially scrap, McKenna had salvaged usable components before its transport to the depot, including a 6-inch segment of high-tensile piano wire that had been part of the rudder trim system. He had retained it in his tool bag, not fully comprehending its potential utility at the time. Now, its purpose was clear. He sat on the hangar floor, the wire and a pair of pliers in hand, and began the intricate process of bending it into a Z shape. The wire was remarkably stiff, resisting the pressure of the pliers. His hand slipped twice, resulting in a cut on his thumb during the second attempt. The blood made the wire slippery. He wiped it clean on his coveralls and persevered. It took him 8 minutes to achieve the correct bend. The Z-shape was designed to function as an inline tensioner, applying just enough preload to the cable to eliminate any residual slack. Installing the modified component proved to be a more arduous task. The confined space within the boom presented a significant challenge. McKenna was compelled to operate with one hand while simultaneously steadying a flashlight with the other. The beam of light danced erratically, casting shifting shadows across the intricate cable assembly. His shoulder became wedged against the structural framework of the boom, and the sharp metal edge inflicted a cut on his arm. He could feel sweat coursing down his back, a testament to the exertion despite the cooler night air. He carefully disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. His fingers fumbled with the clevis pin, and it slipped from his grasp, falling somewhere within the confines of the boom. He spent an agonizing 5 minutes feeling around in the darkness until he finally located it. Throughout this entire ordeal, his heart pounded with an anxious rhythm. He was acutely aware that discovery of his unauthorized modification to a flight control system would result in a court-martial, potentially a dishonorable discharge, and possibly even imprisonment. However, he also understood that Lieutenant Hayes would almost certainly perish if he did not intervene. He proceeded to insert the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, and then reconnected the cable. The fit was exceedingly tight, requiring considerable force to insert the clevis pin. Once it was securely in place, he tested the cable tension by hand, applying pressure. There was no discernible slack. The control surface responded immediately and without hesitation. It was perfect. McKenna meticulously replaced the inspection panel, gathered his tools, wiped away the bloodstains from the wire and his hands, and departed the hangar at 01:15 hours. The tropical night was humid and still. From a distance, he heard the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines, likely Japanese night raiders. The sound sent a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He had just performed an unauthorized modification to a flight control system, utilizing a non-standard component, thereby violating at least a dozen regulations. If the modification were to fail during flight, Lieutenant Hayes would crash, and McKenna would bear full responsibility. Conversely, if it proved successful, Lieutenant Hayes might survive. McKenna retired to his bunk, but found sleep elusive. He remained awake, staring at the ceiling, until the first light of dawn appeared. At 06:30 hours, he made his way to the flight line. He observed the crew fueling and arming Lieutenant Hayes' aircraft, watched Hayes emerge for his pre-flight briefing, and then saw him climb into the cockpit. At 07:42 hours, Lieutenant Hayes commenced his takeoff. McKenna stood on the flight line, his gaze fixed on the P-38 as it ascended into the morning sky. He watched as it joined a formation of 16 other aircraft. He observed them heading northwest, directly towards Japanese-controlled airspace. From that point forward, all he could do was wait. The engagement commenced at 8:14 hours. Lieutenant Hayes's element of 4 P-38s intercepted 9 Zeros at an altitude of 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. The morning sun was positioned advantageously behind them, creating an ideal scenario for a diving attack. Lieutenant Hayes was positioned in the number 3 slot. His element leader announced the incoming threat. They initiated their dive. Hayes targeted a Zero at the rear of the enemy formation. He descended from altitude, accelerating to 380 miles per hour. The Zero rapidly grew larger in his gun sight. Hayes could clearly distinguish the painted rising sun emblem on the fuselage. He could even discern the pilot's head within the canopy. He depressed the trigger. The aircraft's 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon unleashed a torrent of fire. Tracers streaked towards the target. Many rounds missed their mark. A few impacts sparked off the Zero's wing, but they were insufficient to cause significant damage. The Zero executed a sharp right roll and commenced a dive. Hayes rolled to pursue. It was at this precise moment that he experienced it. The aircraft responded instantaneously. There was no discernible delay, no lag whatsoever. The moment he moved the control stick, the aircraft executed the roll with immediate precision. Lieutenant Hayes had never before felt his P-38 respond with such agility. It was as if the aircraft had been anticipating his command and executed it the instant it was given. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the time it normally would. He brought his nose down. The Zero was directly within his sight picture. He fired again, delivering a 3-second burst. The rounds traversed the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Zero's engine erupted in flames. Fragments of the aircraft were flung outwards. The enemy plane rolled inverted and plunged towards the jungle below, trailing thick black smoke. This was Lieutenant Hayes's first confirmed kill, but there was no time for celebration. His wingman urgently transmitted a warning about Zeros diving from above. Hayes glanced upwards and observed 3 of them descending in a shallow dive, approaching with considerable speed. They had witnessed him shoot down their comrade and were now intent on exacting revenge. Lieutenant Hayes shoved the throttles forward, initiating a climb, but the Zeros possessed a superior diving speed. They would be upon him within mere seconds. His only viable option was to reverse his vector and engage them directly. Every instinct screamed at him to continue climbing, to flee. That was the established doctrine. However, he recognized that adhering to doctrine today would likely result in his death. He rolled sharply to the left and pulled back on the stick. The P-38 snapped around with an unprecedented responsiveness. The nose swept through the horizon. He saw the lead Zero. It was attempting to turn and follow him, but it had clearly not anticipated Hayes reversing his course with such abruptness. The Zero was in a precarious position, exposed. Hayes adjusted his aim, fired, and struck the Zero's left wing root. The wing buckled and folded. The Zero tumbled uncontrollably. 2 kills in a span of 30 seconds. The remaining 2 Zeros attempted to scissor maneuver, alternating turns, in an effort to force an overshoot. Hayes maintained his pursuit. Each time they reversed direction, his P-38 snapped into the turn with immediate alacrity. There was no lag, no struggle against the controls. The aircraft performed precisely as he intended, the moment he intended it. It felt as though he were piloting an entirely different aircraft, as if invisible weights had been removed from the control system. One of the Zeros committed a critical error. It reversed its turn too sharply, bleeding off excessive speed. Hayes capitalized on this mistake, maneuvering inside its turn. Engaging at close range, approximately 200 feet, he fired. It was an unmissable shot. The Zero disintegrated under the impact. Pieces of the aircraft cascaded past Hayes's canopy. He felt the P-38 shudder as debris impacted his right boom. 3 kills. The 4th Zero fled. Hayes did not pursue. He was critically low on fuel and ammunition. He ascended back to altitude. He regrouped with the remaining members of his flight. They then set a course for home. The entirety of the engagement had lasted a mere 7 minutes. When Lieutenant Hayes landed his aircraft at Dobodura at 09:03 hours, Sergeant McKenna was already present on the flight line, awaiting his arrival. Hayes shut down the engines and cautiously exited the cockpit. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His flight suit was thoroughly saturated with sweat. He walked directly towards McKenna. Lieutenant Hayes uttered 2 words, his voice thick with emotion. It worked. Unbeknownst to either of them at the time, 6 other pilots had observed Hayes's engagement from a higher altitude. Captain Frank Mitchell had witnessed the entire aerial battle from an altitude of 15,000 feet. Captain Mitchell was a flight leader within the 475th Fighter Group. He had been observing Hayes's element engage the Zeros below when he noticed something decidedly unusual. Hayes's P-38 was executing rolls with a speed far exceeding any lightning Mitchell had ever witnessed. The aircraft seemed to snap through its maneuvers as if it weighed only half its actual mass. Mitchell possessed an intimate knowledge of every pilot operating in the theater, and he was well acquainted with their individual skill levels. Hayes was a competent pilot, certainly, but not to this extraordinary degree. There was undeniably something different about his aircraft. Following his landing, Captain Mitchell sought out Lieutenant Hayes in the debriefing room. Hayes was still experiencing the potent effects of adrenaline, his hands shaking as he meticulously completed his combat report, detailing 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell inquired directly about what had been different about the aircraft that day. Hayes stated that he possessed no definitive explanation. He simply remarked that his aircraft had performed exceptionally well, with enhanced speed and responsiveness. Mitchell then asked if any maintenance had been performed on the aircraft recently. Hayes suggested that he speak with Technical Sergeant McKenna. Captain Mitchell located Sergeant McKenna in the maintenance area approximately 2 hours later. McKenna was engaged in working on a different P-38 aircraft. His hands were visibly stained with black grease, and his coveralls bore evident marks from hydraulic fluid. Mitchell approached him directly and posed the question, "What did you do to Hayes's airplane?" Sergeant McKenna regarded him for a prolonged moment before offering his explanation. "The piano wire tensioner, the cable modification, the unauthorized alteration to the flight control system." Captain Mitchell listened intently without interrupting. Once McKenna had concluded his account, Mitchell inquired if McKenna could perform the same modification on Mitchell's own aircraft. Sergeant McKenna confirmed that he could, but cautioned Mitchell about the inherent risks involved. He emphasized that the modification was neither officially sanctioned nor rigorously tested. He reiterated that if any adverse event were to occur, both of them would face severe disciplinary charges. Captain Mitchell responded unequivocally, stating that he was unconcerned about the potential repercussions. He had seen 4 of his pilots lost during aerial engagements in the preceding month. Each one had been trapped in turning dogfights from which there was no escape. If there was anything that could increase their chances of survival, he was determined to obtain it. Bureaucratic procedures could take a back seat. That very evening, McKenna made adjustments to Mitchell's P-38 aircraft. He utilized the same method for adjusting the tension of the piano wire and the same installation technique. Mitchell took the modified aircraft up the following morning and returned with enthusiastic praise for the enhancement. He informed his wingman that the airplane handled like a nimble fighter rather than a lumbering truck. His wingman then approached McKenna, expressing a desire for the same modification. By August 20th, McKenna had successfully modified 9 airplanes. News of this innovation quickly spread throughout the squadron. Pilots began inquiring with their crew chiefs about the cable modification. Some crew chiefs adhered strictly to regulations and refused, citing it as a violation. Others, however, were open to trying it. McKenna demonstrated the procedure. Cut a length of piano wire, bend it into a Z shape, and install it as an inline tensioner. The entire process took 8 minutes and dramatically improved performance. The modifications were disseminated from pilot to pilot and from mechanic to mechanic. There was no official documentation, no engineering approval, only hushed discussions in the ready room and the maintenance bay. On August 22nd, Hayes shot down 2 more enemy planes using the enhanced controls. Mitchell achieved 3 victories on August 25th. Subsequently, other pilots began returning from missions with confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. The statistical data became too significant to disregard. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group stationed at Guisap, learned of the modification from a pilot who had transferred from Dobodura. Watkins was initially dubious, but decided to test it on 1 aircraft. The pilot returned from his subsequent mission with his first confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed after 8 weeks of combat. Watkins proceeded to modify 4 more aircraft. Other crew chiefs within the 49th began adopting the same practice. By the early days of September, an estimated 40 P-38s in New Guinea had received the modification. The engineering officer at Dobodura observed a noticeable difference, but could not ascertain its cause. During inspections, the control cable tensions appeared normal because the crew chiefs would remove the tensioners before inspections and then reinstall them afterward. The pilots were aware, the mechanics were aware, but no officers were informed. The aircraft destruction ratio began to shift. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific had lost 2 P-38s for every single enemy aircraft destroyed. In August, this ratio improved to 1.3 to 1. By September, the figures were nearly balanced. A significant change had occurred, though officially no one knew its nature. Then, the Japanese took notice. Japanese fighter pilots first reported the observed change in late August. Flight logs from the 11th Air Fleet indicated that American P-38s were engaging in more aggressive maneuvers, executing turns with greater speed, and reversing direction more rapidly. The reports highlighted that tactical approaches, which had proven reliable for months, were suddenly proving ineffective. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most accomplished aces, with 64 confirmed aerial victories, had been engaged in combat with American pilots since the attack on Pearl Harbor. On September 3, 1943, Sakai encountered a P-38 over Wewak. He employed his standard tactic, luring the American into a turning fight, awaiting the P-38's roll initiation, and then sharply reversing his own turn to gain an inside position within the American's turning radius. However, the P-38 mirrored his maneuver. Sakai had executed this particular maneuver countless times. He possessed an exact understanding of how long it took a P-38 to roll, timing it with perfect precision. Yet, this P-38 rolled with unexpected swiftness. Sakai narrowly averted a head-on collision. The American pilot gained a firing solution on him. Sakai was compelled to break away in a dive. He returned to his base bewildered and frustrated. Other seasoned Japanese pilots reported comparable experiences. The American pilots were not adopting new flying techniques. They continued to utilize the same established tactics. However, their aircraft were now responding with greater alacrity. The improvement was fractional, yet substantial enough to disrupt the precise timing that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit. Japanese intelligence attempted to identify the cause of this change. They examined the wreckage of downed P-38s, but found no apparent modifications. The aircraft appeared identical to those they had been confronting for months. Their engines were the same, their armaments unchanged. Nothing externally visible had been altered. What the Japanese were unaware of was that the critical alteration was concealed within the aircraft's boom, a 6-inch piece of piano wire that resembled standard equipment. Even if they had discovered it, they might not have understood its function. It wasn't a new weapon system, nor an improved engine. It was merely a minor adjustment to the control cable tension. Nevertheless, This minor modification was proving fatal to their pilots. By mid-September, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-38s at rates not seen since the early stages of the war. The psychological impact was considerable. For 2 years, Zero pilots had dominated the skies in turning engagements. They were confident in their ability to outmaneuver any American aircraft. That confidence was now eroding. Pilots who had previously pressed their attacks were becoming cautious and hesitant, no longer certain that their tried-and-true tactics would succeed. The Japanese attempted to adapt. Some pilots abandoned attempts to engage P-38s in turning fights, opting instead for hit-and-run tactics. However, this meant relinquishing their primary advantage, the Zero's superior maneuverability. Fighting like a P-38 meant engaging on American terms, and the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, and capable of sustaining more damage. Other pilots sought to compensate by increasing their aggression, closing to shorter firing distances and taking greater risks. But aggression without the ability to outmaneuver an opponent simply led to a quicker demise. Several experienced Japanese pilots perished in September while employing tactics that had been perfectly effective in July. The fundamental challenge for Japanese pilots was their engagement with an unseen adversary. They knew something had changed, but could not identify what it was, nor how to counteract it. Developing countermeasures against an unknown modification is impossible. By the close of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in encounters with P-38s. American losses during the same period amounted to 22 aircraft. The ratio had reversed. For the first time in the Pacific Theater, P-38s were destroying Zeros at a rate exceeding 1-to-1. The Japanese command issued an order prohibiting pilots from engaging P-38s unless they possessed a significant numerical superiority. This directive marked a pivotal moment. The Zero, once the hunter, had become the hunted. And it all stemmed from a piece of piano wire that no one was authorized to install. The modification was never officially recognized during the war. The Army Air Force Engineering Command became aware of it in October 1943, when a maintenance inspector at Dobodura noted inconsistent cable tension readings. He traced the discrepancies to the piano wire tensioners, authored a report, and submitted it through the chain of command. The report languished on desks for 3 weeks, while officers debated the appropriate course of action. The modification contravened regulations, yet it was demonstrably effective. Fighter squadrons employing the modification exhibited measurably superior kill ratios, and pilots were surviving. The core issue was not whether the modification provided a benefit. It was whether to penalize the mechanics who had implemented it without authorization, or to grant retroactive approval. In November, Lockheed dispatched an engineering team to New Guinea to assess the modification. They conducted tests, measured cable tension, calculated stress loads, and performed flight evaluations. Their conclusion was that the modification was both safe and effective, deserving to have been part of the original design. Lockheed subsequently integrated a comparable tensioning system into the P-38J model, which entered production in December 1943. However, McKenna never received official acknowledgement. There was no commendation, no medal, and no mention in any report. Official Lockheed documentation credited the improvement in the control system to engineering analysis. McKenna's name was absent from all records. Hayes survived the war, completing 63 combat missions and shooting down 11 Japanese aircraft. He returned to Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and worked as a crop duster for 37 years. He never forgot McKenna's contribution. Every year on August 17th, Hayes would call McKenna to express his gratitude for saving his life. Mitchell also survived the conflict. He advanced to the rank of squadron commander, led his unit through the Philippines campaign, and achieved 16 aerial victories. Post-war, he remained in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1963. He would recount the story of McKenna's modification to every junior maintenance officer under his supervision, emphasizing that superior solutions can sometimes emerge from enlisted mechanics who identify issues that engineers might overlook. McKenna continued his service in the Army Air Force until 1946. He returned to California and resumed his work on automobiles, opening his own garage in Long Beach in 1948. He dedicated 42 years to engine repair. He rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, stating simply that he was a mechanic who fixed airplanes. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications discovered references to the piano wire tensioner in maintenance logs from New Guinea. The historian located McKenna through veteran registries. By then, McKenna was 73 years old and still working part-time at his garage. When the historian inquired about the modification, McKenna confirmed the story, dismissing it as a simple task that needed to be done. The historian estimated that the modification might have saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives, based on the improved survival rates in squadrons that adopted it. McKenna stated he never kept count. He only remembered the pilots who returned: Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, and the others. That was sufficient. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. He was interred at Pacific View Memorial Park in California. His obituary noted his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic, but made no mention of the piano wire tensioner. It omitted the fact that he had fundamentally altered the way American fighters operated, and that he had defied regulations to preserve lives. His garage in Long Beach still stands, now under new ownership. However, on the wall of the back office, a faded photograph remains. It depicts a young mechanic in overalls standing beside a P-38 Lightning. The date inscribed on the reverse reads August 1943, New Guinea. This illustrates how innovation truly occurs in warfare, not through official channels or engineering committees, but through sergeants and mechanics who identify problems, devise solutions, and act without awaiting permission to save lives. If you found this narrative as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It assists us in sharing more overlooked stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to remain connected with these untold histories. Each one holds significance and merits remembrance. We would also be delighted to hear from you. Please leave a comment below indicating your location. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, encompassing veterans and history enthusiasts alike, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching and for helping to preserve these accounts.